My name is Christy Busby, and you are about to listen to the next episode of my podcast called F.A.T.E. From Atheism to Enlightenment. So come on in, join me. We're going to talk about it all from atheism to enlightenment. Alrighty, guys, here we go. Get ready and welcome to your fate. Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of F.A.T.E. How's everybody doing today? On today's episode, we are talking all things alchemy. What is alchemy? Why is alchemy so mysterious? What are the roots of alchemy? And I have brought none other than Paul Karatis on the show. He is a licensed medical psychologist who has roots in modern esoteric spirituality. He has a book out called The Riddle of Alchemy. How appropriate. We're talking all things alchemy, guys. Paul, welcome to your fate, my friend. How you doing today?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad, Christy. Thank you very much for having me on the show to talk about my new book, The Riddle of Alchemy, which was released at the beginning of January and is available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all places where books are sold. So thank you so much for having me on.
I'm loving the plug. We will definitely put it in the show notes, and I'm very excited to have this conversation because alchemy, if you're living in the spiritual world like me, where you're just stepping into all of these different types of concepts, you do hear the word alchemy used in so many different ways in the spiritual world, and it has so many different meanings, and I'm very clueless as to exactly um where alchemy came about, how it came about, and what it means in modern times today with regards to where we're at in our spiritual development. So, I always like to start at the beginning. Why don't you
Yeah.
go ahead and tell us how did you get into spirituality, alchemy? What is your journey, Paul? What is
Yes.
your journey?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe I should probably start by defining the concept, right? Yeah, so
Yes.
that's probably a good place to start. So, as I've said in the past, the word alchemy is kind of like for many people might be synonymous with magic. So, a lot of people will think of your medieval maverick men at work in their subterranean laboratories trying to create that scintillating saffron powder, which can transmute base metals into gold, right? And that is known as the philosopher's stone. There are a lot of very strong associations with historical figures like the psychiatrist Carl Jung, Jakob Bulmer, and Paracelsus van Hohenheim, who is the father of modern iatrochemistry, right? And allopathic medicine. A lot of people will associate it with chemistry, so kind of like a proto science or the first form of chemistry. Other people will think about mysticism. Other people think about pseudoscience, the occult, speculative philosophy, all of that. Um, so if we were to define it, so loosely we might define it as the art and the science of transformation. But etymologically, so where the word actually comes from, it derives from the Greek chimia, which means to cast or smelt, and the Egyptian kemet, which means black earth and kind of alludes to the black silt of the River Nile. So more specifically, it's kind of like a chemical operative. So it's a physical process, but it's also a spiritual discipline with, kind of philosophical and practical dimensions. And, it first coalesced within the intellectual melting pot of Alexandria in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period. So roughly about 300 BCE and in late antiquity. So alchemy kind of assimilated ideas from, Eastern mysticism, the Hermetic Neoplatonic, the Gnostic traditions, Aristotelian theories of matter, the Egyptian metallurgical crafts, astrology, the ancient mystery schools, all of that is contained in alchemy. And it subscribes to the animistic idea that all is one, right? And one thing can be transmuted into another, right? So there's the prima materia, which is the first substance, and everything is hewn from that first substance. Hence, everything is related and everything can be transformed, from one thing to another. Um, so, yeah, so all is one. And basically, what else? Alchemy. Well, I'm trying to give you some more information. So alchemists in general were kind of chiefly concerned with replicating and augmenting processes that they observed in nature in artificial settings. So, for example, like creating a diamond body from carbon, and usually this was done in a laboratory, right? So, by the time the celebrated father of iatrochemistry, who I referenced earlier, the Swiss alchemist and Dr. Paracelsus, came along seeking what he called a universal knowledge, the tradition had become quite heterogeneous in scope. Okay, so and practice, and it was kind of intimately concerned with some of the following outcome goals, which I'll stipulate now. So, gold making and silver making, right? So that's obviously the obvious one through metallic transmutation, and that's an idea which is associated more with Western alchemy. So the transformation of base metals like lead into silver and gold. Then obviously the preparation of the philosopher's stone, which is also called the ultima materia. And that's kind of like the scintillating white and red powders that can transmute base metals into silver and gold. Then the other one that is infrequently mentioned is spagyria, which is kind of like the concoction of herbal medicines, right? Through alchemical processes like, I suppose, distillation and sublimation. And that was also quite popular, in the Middle Ages. And then also one that's also equally infrequently mentioned is attempts to create an artificial life form, which is known as the homunculus, in an alchemical vessel, an alembic. And one other thing is the preparation of drinkable gold, and that was called aurum potabile or something like that, which was used as an antidote for many ailments, right? So yeah, so I think in hindsight, it might be germane to speak about alchemy in pluralistic terms. So thinking
Yeah.
about alchemies instead of alchemy wasn't a monolithic solitary endeavor, and it meant something different to each practitioner, if that makes sense.
It well, it totally makes sense,
Mhm.
and really, when you're reading the book, you understand the scope of how varied this, technique is, and the ways in which people use to speak about it are it's spiritual, it's chemical. Um, let's get a little bit into the history of it being suppressed for by the church.
Mm.
It seems for the most part. I assume it would well, you can tell me.
Yeah.
You're the historian on this,
Mm.
but it feels like intention. It feels like our own consciousness has a lot to do with how this process is completed.
Mhm.
It's almost like a ceremony. It's
Yes.
almost like a ritual of sorts. You could say occultish for sure.
Yes.
But let's talk about the church and how they got involved and really tried to suppress this information and keep keep us from it,
Yes,
essentially.
absolutely. And alluding to the secretive nature of alchemy, right? So, so during the Middle Ages, especially, alchemy was kind of thought of as a derivative of magic, right? So it was people would equate it to magic, right? So, and obviously, when something is magic, the church doesn't approve. As I've stipulated in many interviews before, what the church thought was that man suffers because of sin, right? And for that, there is only one remedy, which is apparently God's grace, which is what the priests were trying to dispense. Magic is kind of like a cosmology or worldview that has an explanation for everything, one would say. And the Catholic Church equated magic and its derivatives with satanic forces, right? So, according to the hegemony of the Catholic Church, the worldview espoused by the biblical scriptures, right, replete with its own supernatural agency, was to be learned and not questioned, right? So, we weren't supposed to peer under stones, right? Alchemy, of course, is an esoteric discipline which attempts to bend nature to one's will. So, some of the things that it wants to do is manipulate, multiply, maneuver the natural order. Always working with nature and not against nature, but it wants to manipulate and manage and maneuver things the way that it wants. And kind of an alchemist can be thought of as like a little demiurge, right? So, attempting to replicate natural processes like the synthesis of precious stones, metals, concentrated natural elixirs, and the such in artificial settings. So a paragon of the ultimate anathema to the Catholic priests, right? They didn't like that at all. So the piety, I suppose, of the alchemists and magicians was that they dared to interrogate God's creation, to peer under stones, to look for answers where humankind was meant to simply accept what they found on the surface level. It was in such a kind of like an intellectual climate that curiosity, right, kind of like became considered a sin, by the Catholic Church and the priests. Kind of like a lust of the eyes. I think it was Saint Augustine that said that. So that was precisely apparently what had led Adam astray in Eden, and it was the impetus for his fall, right? So the alchemical endeavor, which is both a chemico-operative discipline and a psycho-spiritual permutation, is kind of like a wholly personal affair. And it's kind of chiefly geared towards self-improvement, self-growth, purification, enlightenment. So anything that takes the practitioner away from these things is I guess, a form of self-sabotage, and a recipe for disaster. So things like fame, notoriety, commercialization of the process, anything that contaminates the process by taking the focus away from aims and objectives, which are kind of like tied to inner mental processes, that those things have to be obviated. So we must remain humble. Okay, so this is one overarching idea in alchemy, is that humility is very, very important in the process. So I remember hearing the Magus of Strombolos talk once, and one of the things he said was that fame is a trap in our spiritual path, and alchemy is a spiritual discipline. So it makes sense from that perspective.
I do love that if you're gonna subscribe to this alchemy at all, and you're going to practice it in any way, whether it be physically, mentally, spiritually, that you need to be. I wouldn't say pure of heart, but you definitely have to be pure intentions, maybe.
Hmm.
Pure intentions.
Yes. Yes.
That does say a lot about it. Also, it says a lot about the church and church organizations that I keep saying on the show over and over again, that it really is more about controlling what you think. Anybody that wants, even looking at the Adam and Eve story, and they say the tree of knowledge is what they were going to be like. The fact that they want to keep us dumb.
Yes. 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 Yeah. 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 Totally. It works. Yeah.
Doesn't that say it all, really?
Yeah.
That one of the premises, the big stories of the Bible, is that they were not supposed to eat of this tree that was supposed to enlighten them and give them knowledge that I don't know. I don't even exactly know. God didn't want them to have knowledge. That doesn't seem to make sense to me, but
Yeah. It doesn't. He wanted to keep all the knowledge for himself, right?
yes.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
who is
Yeah.
he sharing it with if not
Yeah,
us? Like
he wanted to keep him in the dark and in the shadows so that he could have control, and that's one way in which we can control other people is to keep that knowledge for ourselves, to not disseminate it or share it,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
What
mm,
do you feel like, when I'm traveling in my spiritual circles, I hear things like alchemizing your emotions, or transmuting your emotions, or things of that nature. What does that mean exactly? Do you know?
um,
When people say you have to alchemize that, you have to transmute that,
yeah,
you know,
trans.
you know.
A lot of the as soon as I hear alchemize, like my mind usually
Yes.
goes to transpose, or either, I mean, transform, but transform can mean so many different things, right? Or raise to a higher level. And one definition of alchemy that I had read about recently, it's a from a Paracelsian book that I was reading, and alchemy in that book was defined as the raising of vibrations, right? And I thought that that was an interesting statement, the raising of vibrations. So I guess my mind would go to transposition, transfiguration, transposition, when I'm thinking of alchemizing, you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
sometimes the word it can be used in so many different contexts because it means something different to each individual. As
Yes.
I said, under the umbrella term transformation, like it kind of like the science and art of transformation. So it can mean many, many different things. But the raising of vibrations is a pretty interesting principle. And, I think one thing that I talk about in the book is that, during the act of creating the philosopher's stone, there's the lesser circulation and the greater circulation. And the lesser circulation you can apparently, perform without raising any vibration. But in the greater circulation, it involves putting something of oneself into the work, right? And that involves raising the vibration somehow. So inserting some deg- some mental energy into the work is important, and I assume that that mental energy has to be unadulterated. So you have to be able to focus on the task at hand and not let your thoughts be contaminated by anything external. So that's where my mind is going, is to this raising of vibrations concept.
I think one of the most interesting concepts of alchemy when you start looking at its history and, reading your book and whatnot is how it highlights that we are truly more powerful than we think we are when it
Right.
comes to affecting our exterior reality with
Yes.
our intentions, with our thoughts, with our own consciousness.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the most, because, let's face it, I'm not a chemistry major by any stretch, and there was parts of your book that were hard for me to wrap my head around
Yes.
because parts of alchemy date back to very kind of um, it's a science of it in its own,
Mhm.
right? In a
Mhm.
way, I think, like you can literally, there's many different scientific disciplines out there that you could point to, whether it be chemistry, biology, zoology, lots.
Yes.
I think this is a scientific discipline in its own right that is beyond what obviously our natural scientific categories would compose of. But
Yes.
nonetheless, what is most um, exciting to me is this revelation that when we put our focus, when we put our consciousness, when we put our intentions into having something happen, then it does actually have power.
Mhm.
There is power behind that. So what brought you to the topic of alchemy? What is your spiritual development? Where are you at in your world of spirituality?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a pretty interesting question and quite apropos. So the way that I came to alchemy, the subject, it was pretty much happenstance and kind of serendipitous, I would say. In 2005, I went back to university. I had a protracted break from formal studies, uh, in, and I was doing a degree in professional writing and speech. At the time, I rematriculated at La Trobe University in Bandura. As you know, I'm originally from Australia, and I ended up studying things like, fiction, creating nonfiction, publishing and editing, and so forth. And one elective that I took during the time was a subject that was called Jung's cultural psychology, which was taught by the renowned Jungian scholar David Tacey. And, that pretty much heralded the beginning of a love affair with the work of the psychiatrist Carl Jung, who I'm a huge fan of. And he's frequently touted as the father of analytical psychology. So, one of his main contributions to psychology is kind of like the concept of psychological archetypes and the collective unconscious. And I was kind of initially drawn to the evolution of the great mother archetype in Western civilization. I kind of read his Memories, Dreams, Reflections book, which is kind of like his renowned autobiographical work. And that was kind of like a very consummate, immersive experience for me. And then later, I kind of started to explore tomes of his collected works. And, this is when I discovered that Jung basically had spent like the second half of his intellectual and professional life exploring and pretty much trying to unravel the primordial mysteries of alchemy, right? So, kind of like the last three volumes of his collected works are Psychology and Alchemy, Alchemical Studies, and Mysterium Canoncius, I think. And these deal exclusively with that subject, with the subject of alchemy. So my initial fascination with Carl Jung was pretty much the yellow brick road, which led me back to the Emerald City of, we can say, alchemy, if we want to use that kind of language. And I was kind of really interested in the historiography, so the academic study of alchemical manuscripts, but I was also interested in the esoteric application of the tradition. And I think one of the highlights of my academic career was being able to study the Western esoteric traditions, formally through Exeter University in the UK. Right. So, and when we say Western esotericism, that can kind of like loosely be defined as a vitalistic counterculture and, apocryphal kind of system of knowledge And I studied with Exeter University between 2011 and 2013. And they ran a master's and a PhD program in Western esotericism for many years. But, unfortunately, the then program chair, Nicholas Goodrich Clark, passed away, and they had to shut down the program because they couldn't find another theosophy professor to sit as the chair. So basically, at about the time that I finished the degree, I had my own spiritual awakening, what we would call a spiritual awakening. And then I met someone with a kind of a very clear psychic opening, who pretty much not only validated some of my own esoteric beliefs about the cosmos, but kind of gave an entirely new meaning to the line. And I think, I usually frequently quote this line, which is, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy," which most actually will recognize as a famous line from the Shakespearean Hamlet.
All right. So now I have a few questions about your spiritual awakening
Yes.
because those are all topics of my favorite topics on this
Mm.
show. Was your spiritual awakening in the vein of a trauma, and that you had to go through something, and in order to do that, it kind of opened
Yes.
you up?
Yes. Yeah, and I'm happy to reveal a little bit about it. So, like basically, I met this girl who used to say this guy would come to her in her sleep. Um, and over time, and I think he served some kind of premonitory function. Like he would always appear before something was going to happen, almost like a forewarning. And he, and in the very beginning, I was a little bit suspicious of the contact. I'm like, is there an ulterior motive to having contacted me and telling me these stories, or is this bona fide like a psychic opening? Anyway, so I had questions regarding the legitimacy of what she was telling me. And, one day she comes back at me and she said, so and so, she would call him Lucas. So his name was Lucas, told me some things about you and for me to tell you this and that you would understand what it was. Okay. Yeah. Which I thought was pretty interesting. And I said, sure, try. So she weaves this story of two soulmates that were once really madly enamored of one another. And, like they progressed, one was a good soulmate. The other one was a not so good soulmate. And she described this relationship in very, very figurative, abstract and metaphoric terms, though there were specific details in the narrative that I recognized immediately as being elements of a past relationship of mine that had ended in a trauma. And it was a very significant trauma. Um, and the reason why the entity said he was sharing this information with me was to help me surmount the conundrum, the challenge of what I was going through at the time. So I was, in complete emotional turmoil at the time. I wasn't understanding why this had happened. And, through the words of this entity, I was, basically led to some kind of eureka moment in that, oh, this is what happened. And, I shouldn't perseverate too much on it. So I thought it was very compelling. And, yeah, I felt like it was veridical. It was true.
That is a fascinating awakening story.
Mm,
That, in a way, is something that could definitely rattle you and shake you to your core.
mm.
And from can I also ask you, you said that you were in they informed you of um some s- something the way in which our universe works, or the way our cosmos
Yes,
works.
yes, I
What
remember.
what
Yeah, I remember something about, he said something about people, the way that it works is that you, it was described in very, I mean, I don't remember the specifics, but he described it in very, very, allegorical terms. Like, life is kind of like walking through a hallway and then you open the door and then you exit and then you close the door behind you and then you enter into another doorway, but you can never quite remember what came before. And to me, I thought that was an interesting reference because I thought that that was an allusion to reincarnation, right?
That's
Yeah. Like,
what I was thinking. I'm
yeah,
like, that's reincarnation.
yeah, yeah,
That's what it says to me too. Like
yeah,
that's literally like you're walking in a hallway, which is like your life,
yeah,
and then you're walking, you end up opening a door, which could be your death in a
yes,
way.
yeah,
And then you walk through that door and you walk into yet another life,
yeah, yeah,
which that makes a lot of sense to me with all the stuff that I've been exposed to on this podcast.
yes.
That symbolism, that kind of story, that I think perfectly encapsulates what reincarnation is.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I completely agree with you, and that's where my mind went automatically when
Yeah.
she referenced this. And mind you, she didn't know what she was talking about. Like, it was almost like she was a conduit, a vehicle for me to receive this information, and it was almost like the curtains coming up momentarily, and the universe showing me something, and that maybe we haven't quite figured everything out just yet. And then the curtains went back down because so I eventually so this happened sometime in 2012, 11, 12. Anyway, so I went to Greece in 2013 because she was from Greece, Athens, and I ended up meeting her. I actually stayed with her and her family. And we had some subsequent conversations around that topic, and she was so confused because she said to me, she goes, "Paul," she goes, "What was that?" She goes, "What was he describing?" And I'm like, "Oh my God." I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too sure about whether I should tell you exactly what he was describing, but I understood what he was describing." So I thought that was fascinating. And one thing that she was grappling with, because it was such a clear psychic opening for her, um, one thing she was grappling with was, whether this was a veridical experience or whether she was just going crazy, right? And, one thing that she told me was that, like in having conversations with her friends, frequently Lucas would tell her things about her friends, right? Total breach of boundaries, by the way. Right?
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, when you're revealing information like that about other people, it's obviously coming through a paranormal or a supernormal force, but the ethics of that, right? You always think about the ethical implications of that. So he would reveal information about her friends to her, and then she had no way of verifying this information. So she would ask them, in a conversation, like she would say, "Is this true?" And then they'd be like, "Yeah, it is. How do you know this?" And then that would validate to her that the information that she had received supernormally was true, but she sometimes struggled to um, basically explain to the individuals involved how she had received this information, right? So maybe sometimes she would say, "Oh, it was just I just guessed. I'm very intuitive, right?" So I thought that was pretty interesting. It was hilarious.
Is she still talking to Lucas?
I have no idea. We lost contact after I came back in from Greece to Australia in 2014. So I never heard from her again. We just gradually lost contact as she kind of faded off into the distance. But my assumption is that he does frequently interact with her. I believe that the first time he interacted with her, she told me it was when she was young, like maybe 8 or 9 or 10, and then the contact has occurred intermittently through her life trajectory. So, and he usually comes at times where is a something of some importance or significance is about to transpire. So I thought that was pretty fascinating. It's one of the more compelling, examples of supernormal agency and something, supernormal going on. So yeah, for me, I'm like, wow, that's a very clear psychic opening. And I don't know how I personally would grapple with something like that, and how I would deal with that. I think I would really struggle if I had that kind of psychic opening. So
I think for me, at first, I would probably because face it, we are so programmed to not accept things like that.
yeah,
Like even that story sounds super fantastical, but I have to say like I am now at the stage where I would welcome
yeah,
almost something like that because it doesn't frighten me. I am so convinced that there's so much more out there about our reality, our world, that we are not informed on,
Yeah.
and that when you open yourselves up and you become more curious and you open your mind, that I think the universe kind of starts talking back a little bit.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And it entails humility as well. And I think certain signs can be revealed to you when you're in the appropriate state of mind and when you're receptive. A lot of that happens during, dreaming states, like during nocturnal states of consciousness. For some reason, because I know the ego is in abeyance or whatever, like the ego is retracted. So you're more receptive to everything that's out there. But the incident was very interesting because even in the aftermath, like we're talking about years afterwards, I would think back and I'm like, did that actually really happen? Like you start to question your own sanity, right? Because you're like, well, according to the norms of, conventional science and orthodox science today, that shouldn't be possible. Yet here
Exactly.
it is and it happened. And I'm like, so why did this happen and how did this happen? And, what have we not understood about the universe, right? The mechanics of the universe and the way that it works. So I thought that was fascinating. And that was like, you know, over the course of like what, like I was in contact with her for like maybe 2 years, 2, 3 years, I would say, where we knew one another. We had frequent contact. We would email one another. We would, talk to one another on Facebook and things like that. So yeah, it was an extraordinary, phenomenally phenomenal moment, which, I'll never forget. And also one way in which the universe was telling me like you're on the right path. Does that make sense? Don't stop,
Yes.
keep going, you know?
Yes.
So, I'm very metaphysically inclined. I have metaphysical leanings and I love metaphysical inquiries. So, I frequently define myself as a clinical psychologist with esoteric leanings, right? So
Yes.
that we qualify it that way. Yeah. Yeah.
And it also sounds like Lucas, if I had to guess, was definitely an entity, but it sounds almost like one of her spirit guides is coming to
Yes,
her and
yeah,
talking to her.
yeah, so the
That's what it
way
sounds.
that yes, correct, yeah. So the way that, she told me was that apparently Lucas was once alive, okay? So she said that he was once alive and that when he passed away, he connected with her because he saw, how magnanimous and beautiful her soul was, and he wanted to be her spirit guide, so he went to her. Um he didn't refer to her by her name. He referred to her by a different name. I don't know if that's a reference to a soul name. My name wasn't Paul either. He referred to me as Olin. Um, and in the very beginning, I thought that she was Olin as in Olyn. But then I'm like, Olin might be O apostrophe Lynn. And I don't know if that's some kind of former incarnation or I have no idea why that name was coming up. Right.
My gut, my first instinct was just that. Oh, I'm like, oh, that's one of your past lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
From what I understand, we do have, more than one life. We come down here and, expand our soul, raise our vibration, expand our consciousness, learn, grow, learn. And we're coming down on this plane regularly with the same people. So,
Yeah.
we tend to interact with the same circles of soul families
Mhm.
and, you know, it's it's fascinating. I'm super open to all of this. So for me, maybe I'm certainly not cynical in this situation. I'm certain like some crazy stuff has happened to me in the last 3 years and I'm excited about staying on this journey and learning more about the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And I also think that we are coming upon a time where you're going to see a lot of people start to awaken. And, we're in the age of the Aquarius, Paul. Like we have
Yes,
a
I know.
new age
Yes.
coming in. There's going to be new energy coming in. There's going to be an awakening. There's going to be a whole different vibe here on this plane. And I'm trying to hold on because there's always, like I'm in LA. We had fires this year. Like
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
um, really it's an experience that you can't understand unless you're in it because the Sunset Fire was the one closest to me. And I literally watched it explode from nothing into something that could really impact me in a very, very real way.
Yeah.
And I was trying very hard to stay just calm, calm, not panic. One of the things that has just helped me navigate this time in my life is this path because I just have a sense of peace no matter what is going on around me. Because I do feel like I'm just an eternal being of light. I'm here having an experience. I'm going to open another door.
Mm.
Don't get too wrapped up in worrying about the day to day of what's happening on our planet because I think all of it is kind of energetic and spiritual. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that statement, and just like because you referenced the fires, always thinking alchemistically,
Yes,
in
exactly.
the context of fire being kind of like the primal mover of elemental rotation in alchemy, and the symbolism of fire itself, right? So we had all these conflagrations in LA proper, and thinking about what fire means, it's obviously purification for many people, but it's also incineration, right? Too, and death. And the cycle, it brings to mind the cycle of death, rebirth, regeneration, that type of thing, right? So, yeah, like, and there can be no new beginning without the old first having been cleared away, right? So, to ascend, one must first descend. So there can
That's
be
right.
no light without darkness, or light is born from darkness, right? Uh, they appear as ostensible opposites, but they're not. One is contained within the other. And that's the whole yin yang thing. So that's why when I think of fire, I always think about purification and new beginnings, right? From old moorings. So that's what's coming up for me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt the same way. I mean, I don't look through an alchemized lens or an
Yeah.
alchemy lens, but I certainly when it was happening, there was a there was a thought within that said, this will mean a rebirth for LA. This needed to happen so we can move on to the
Yeah.
next energetic phase.
Yeah.
Um
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the planets, metals, the four elements,
Mhm.
and alchemy, and
Yep.
how they all relate to each other, how they're all connected.
Yes, absolutely. So should we hang on, I'm trying. Oh yeah. So yeah, so that's going to some basic theory, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so should we do maybe the four elements first?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so basically, we have four elements with their secondary characteristics, and these are apparently the first differentiation from the materia prima, the prime substance. So we have fire, which is hot and dry. Then we have water, which is another element, and that's cold and wet. And then we have air, which is hot and wet. And then we have earth, which is dry and cold, right? So they have secondary characteristics. So hence when kind of like the alchemists are relaying details of their practical work in laboratory settings, they kind of describe this abstruse process, which is characterized by distinct phases, which are based on coloration and mediated by the seven planetary powers, right? So um, under this kind of, sorry,
It's okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Because
He's jet lagged, folks.
I'm
He's jet
totally jet
lagged.
lagged. Yeah. Anyway, under kind of this animistic paradigm and system of knowledge, each planet was kind of like ascribed rulership over specific constituents in the mineral, the plant, and the animal kingdoms, right? So the planet metal relationship was especially overstated in alchemical manuscripts because of its central role in the creation of the philosopher's stone. So Saturn was inextricably connected with lead, Jupiter is connected with tin, Mercury with quicksilver, Venus is with copper, the moon is with silver, and the sun, of course, with the most illustrious and ostensibly what we can say incorruptible metal, which is gold. Okay. So the sun gold and the moon silver connections, those two connections, they're primordial and they've existed since prehistoric times, and the ancient people knew about this. Then we have the innovations of late antiquity, and those are Venus, the connections of Venus copper, Mars iron, and Saturn lead. And then last but not least, we have Mercury and Quicksilver and Jupiter and tin. And those are dyads which kind of took shape under the auspices of the Middle Ages. So while there were kind of differences of opinion between the novice and the seasoned practitioners of this esoteric arts when it came to the sevenfold or the 12-fold process, alchemical process, by which the philosopher's stone was concocted or created, right? The planet and metal relationships remained pretty much impervious to conceptual amendment and extraordinary consistent across time. So these connections have remained consistent from, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago to today. Okay. So it's a pretty interesting process, and most alchemists will describe the same kind of linear or nonlinear progression. So what we can say is that the overwhelming squadron of alchemists describe this kind of process. So they'll say the Saturnine, the jovial, and the lunar forces lunarized the base matter, okay, by galvanizing chemical processes such as like calcination, solution, and putrefaction. And that brings about the nigredo, which is the putrefaction phase, and the albedo, which is the whitening phase in the sealed vessel. And then successful completion of the widening phase bestows upon the alchemist the gift of the white stone. Okay, so this is the lesser work or the lesser circulation. And this gives you the power of healing ailments and of transmuting base metals like lead or mercury into silver. And then further operations were then carried out under the patronage of the Venusian, Martian, and the solar forces, which solarized, okay, the just formed white stone through chemical reduction, sublimation, was it coagulation and fermentation, I think. And then the subsequent reactions known as the yellowing, which is the citronitis, and the rubedo, which is the reddening, um, follow. And then this culminates in the synthesis of the scintillating red powder of significant weight, which is known as the red stone. And another word for it is obviously the philosopher's stone. This is the greater circulation. Okay,
Is
so it's also called the Ultima Materia. Okay, so they call it that too. So it has many names: the Ultima Materia, the Philosopher's Stone, the Red Stone, and this was kind of like the alchemists
which
coveted.
adds I think that is part of, like, why things are get so convoluted and hard to understand is because you do have different people saying the same thing using different words, it feels like, for a lot of this. Um, also, is all of this history and all of these things and all the connections with the planets and the elements and alchemizing and using our own intention to power these sources, um, is this happening in modern day? Is our government hiding from this? Are they making gold in a backyard somewhere? And like, what really are the real life
Yeah,
like applications of this information?
amazing. Yeah, I know a lot of people will ask that frequently, and I think a lot can be taken. I mean, as I've mentioned before, I'm not a practitioner of, like, I don't partake in chemical operative alchemy, right? I am a believer in it, and I think that certainly, base substances can be transmuted to silver and gold, and thankfully I've been in contact with several individuals who have basically characterized themselves as practitioners of the alchemical arts and have, shown me, photographic evidence of having engaged in transmutation or transmutational feats. So I definitely think that there's something more to it, and that, certain base metals can be transmuted into gold. But, I am primarily interested in it from a mental health perspective as well. Right. So, one of the things that I was referring to earlier was the fact that, I was led to alchemy through the work of Carl Jung, and he was immensely interested in alchemy from a mental health or psychiatric perspective. And one of the lessons that I learned in reading a lot of his work and, other works, the other alchemical works by writers who were psychologists or psychiatrists, is that, you know, there's always a reference to not contaminating the work and belief in the work itself, right? So when you're engaged in this alchemical process, you're supposed to have absolute faith in the process, and you can't let your work be contaminated by doubt. And and then you start to make specific connections. Like for me, uh, doubt, when we allow ourselves to wallow in doubt, it can definitely destroy or ruin or impede a specific process from coming into being. And the way that we know this is through dreams, right? So if we recall some of our dreams, which many of us do on a daily basis, so I'm pretty sure you yourself have had flying dreams. I know that a lot of people do have flying dreams. Not everyone does, but I've had flying dreams before. And one of the things that happens in a flying dream is that, you'll have wings and then you'll spread your wings and you'll start to fly and you're soaring up in the skies and you're enjoying the sunshine or whatever, whatever you're doing. And you're, kind of viewing all the people below. You have a 360-degree view of the world below. And then all of a sudden there's this not element of doubt, but then you start to question what you're doing and you're like, wait, this shouldn't be possible. So I don't live. You say to yourself, this isn't a world of eternal feasibilities. Why am I flying? I mean, I know that technically I'm not supposed to be able to fly. And then the moment that seed of doubt is planted, you fall to the
Ground.
ground, right? Right. So what's the lesson? It's almost like your subconscious or unconscious, if you like, is trying to convey a specific lesson. And that's don't doubt the work.
Yeah.
Don't doubt the veracity of what you're doing, like your process itself, because, it'll impede it. It'll obstruct it from coming to pass or coming to be, I should say. Right.
I think that is also, I believe a lot of the law and law of attraction, and I believe in vibration, frequency, resonance. And if you are aligning with a negative, lower vibrations,
Mhm.
you're, you know, no matter what you're trying to do, probably is not going to pan out the way you had thought because you're not aligning with the correct energy.
Mhm.
You know, one of the other interesting things about alchemy that I didn't realize until actually I read your book
Mhm. Yeah.
was that alchemy is alchemical
Mhm.
and it is spiritual and filled with symbolism. And
Mhm.
as you had mentioned, Carl Jung coming on and expressing that and really illuminating us to that um, premise with
Yes.
his work. But can you talk a little bit more about Carl Jung and what the symbolism means in our spiritual development, dark night of the soul, things of that nature that people reference alchemy and it's in a more spiritual, not in a turning let's turn, lead into gold. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the
Yeah.
spiritual development of humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Carl Jung got into this in like the 1920s. So his intellectual curiosity was piqued by this Chinese mystical treatise, which was called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which is a pretty interesting text. It's a spiritual text. And he stumbled upon this quite like serendipitously, and it was sent to him by this sinologist, Richard Wilhelm. And so as he, kind of looked through the text, he was struck by the ample use of the mandala symbolism, right? So the wheel of life or the magic circle, which we're all familiar with. And this cropped up repeatedly in his patients' own dreams and their reveries, right? So there were also some specific Chinese signs in there, like two specific signs which were metaphysical symbols for higher soul, a higher soul which remains temporarily active after death, and a body soul disintegrating at death, right? So there's some metaphysical implications there. But these were translated by Wilhelm as an animus and an anima. Okay. And this interpretation was influenced by the pictograms that accompanied the Chinese hieroglyphs for the psychic structures. So basically, what was being represented in this manuscript was this masculine cloud demon and a corporeal white ghost. So Jung basically took this interpretation as gospel and ran with it, kind of like at a supersonic speed, because it seemed to conform to his psychological worldview. So he then shifted his attention to medieval manuscripts, right? And he started to examine those, and he basically began to interpret the rich tapestry of alchemical images from within an analytic lens. Okay, so he tried to bring all these images in line with the lens of his evolving analytical psychology. So there was a lot of winged dragons, there's a lot of tail swallowing serpents, there's a lot of copulating couples in these manuscripts. And these were all symbols for specific stages in the individuation process. Okay. So the individuation process, according to Jung, is the process by which someone becomes a more refined version of themselves, right? Jettisons all the shadow and, these other undesirable aspects of self. So this is a pretty interesting idea. And it was a very anachronistic or a historical approach to looking at many of these alchemical manuscripts, right? So it baffled a lot of people. Um, So yeah, so we can also call it the process by which an individual integrates their unconscious shadow and conscious life and becomes kind of like this actualized self. And this is an ultra refined and superlative version of themselves, or however you want to see it. So what Jung said both overtly and covertly was that the Philosopher's Stone was nothing but a hair-raising chemical fantasy, right? And that what is portrayed in the alchemical treatises is simply aspects of the dreamer's unconscious conflict projected onto matter. Okay. So after intense study, he also came to the conclusion, I suppose, that the fixation with alchemy was kind of like a reflective, knee-jerk reaction against the Christian patriarchy, right? With its kind of sanctimonious pontification of the moral life and its emphasis on the aesthetic masculine consciousness. So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting concept. So he ascribed to a purely psychological interpretation of
Right.
alchemy, and he believed that the alchemists weren't transmuting anything, and it was purely a projective process, right? Yeah.
Where do you lie in that?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think that definitely in some alchemical manuscripts, what they're referring to are chemicals, you know, and like, I think that with Jung, he kind of came to the study of alchemy with latent presentiments and preconceptions, and he showed, right? So he made theoretical leaps that were not criticized at the time that he made them. And there is some doubt surrounding the experiment, like kind of like the experiment, experiential legitimacy of what he calls the solar phallus man. So, and a lot of people won't know what that is, but when he was working at the Bagolzi psychiatric hospital in Zurich in Switzerland, he encountered this schizophrenic patient whose hallucinated world birthed animate images of the sun with a prehensile phallus. Okay, so according to the patient, uh, these four winds were generated at the behest of the phallic motion. And after comparing the hallucinated content to descriptions of a Mithraic liturgy found in this unpublished Greek papyrus, where a phallic tube was suspended from the bottom of the solar nimbus, embodied by the aerial forces, Jung concluded then that both must have sprung from a common source, a shared mind. Okay. That could be passed down from generation to generation. So this basically came to be known as the collective unconscious, which he defined as the deepest level of the human mind. And this is the stratum which encompasses like the universal, the archetypal, the primordial forms, which predetermine consciousness. And he also said that mythic symbols were the core language of the collective unconscious and that were particularly abundant in altered states of consciousness. They could come through in psychotic states, right? So it spurred Jung to make other elaborations. So, and he claimed that the collective unconscious wasn't a person or something like, but it was something like a stream of consciousness, or an ocean of images and figures, which drift into consciousness in our dreams or in abnormal states of consciousness. So he's been criticized for that view by many, 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 many people. So Richard Knoll, he's one of Jung's chief detractors, has argued that kind of like both the English and the German translations of the Mithraic text were in circulation before the patient's hallucination came to pass. And this insinuates that cryptomnesia may have been responsible for it, for the patient's visionary experience, right? It's a much more feasible explanation for the phenomenon, which is fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah.
Does that make, yeah, right? And
Yeah.
then just to add, kind of more spice to the image, to this his interpretation. So there are specific historians of science that have said that Jung and Mircea Eliade, right? So they're adherents of what they call this presentist interpretation of alchemical imagery, and this kind of grew out of the 19th century Victorian fascination with occultism. So the acolytes of this school devalue the philosophical and scientific aspects, and value of the great work, right? Or dismiss it as kind of like a hair raising chemical fantasy. So the crux of their argument is that the same alchemical symbols that were used by Jung to progress his psychological rendition are basically code names for chemicals and minerals which bear no association whatsoever with kind of like nascent unconscious content,
Hmm.
so which is pretty interesting. in and of itself.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think this debate is gonna continue.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things that will go on and on and on. And it kind of makes sense that, sometimes we project our own implicit biases onto other eras and times, and that indeed what these alchemists were doing maybe was something chemical in nature, and they were has nothing to do with projecting their unconscious onto matter. But then again, there's also a third way, which maybe both are true, right? So we live in an era or time where we're told it's one or the other, right? We have
Yeah.
to recourse to an either or philosophy. And maybe why can't there be room for both of these interpretations to be true, right?
I tend to lean that way
Yeah,
because I see truth in both of those
yeah,
arenas,
yeah.
and I think that it's very often that it is more than one truth, and there's a little truth mixed into many of the things that are out there currently.
Yes.
Um, we are coming up on an hour, but I will say this, I could probably go another just talking about alchemy because it is so rich with the variations of interpretations of it. It's hard to understand. I'm still not 100% wrapped my head around it, but I'm not nearly as smart as you are, Paul.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well,
I'm just not. I certainly don't have your vocabulary.
uh, yeah, yeah. It's years and years of study. That's what years and years of academic and personal study does, is that, it builds layers and layers of knowledge. And sometimes, I think about all these things and I'm like, you start to get confused yourself. I'm like, is it this or is it that or is it that? And, you have a lot of all these streams of information coming at you. And at the end of the day, you're the interpreter of this information and you need to come to your own conclusions about what may or may not be true based on what you know
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
true or feel to be true, here. Right. So there's, right. So,
All right.
but, yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna ask you one final question, and then we're
Yes.
gonna we're
Yeah.
gonna we're gonna wrap it up. What is your what do you think the nature of reality is? What do you think we're doing here? What is your now
Mm.
knowing everything you know, going through your own spiritual awakening? What are your thoughts?
About the nature of reality.
Yes.
Um, hmm. This is a very deep and very, very personal question. Um, you know, uh, as I've said to many people before, is that I try not to pigeonhole myself into any, you know, uh, particular philosophical belief, or like, I don't like to brand myself or term myself in any way. Like, for instance, a lot of people like, are you like a materialist? Are you a non-materialist? Do you believe consciousness precedes matter? Is it matter over mind, or is it mind over matter? Do you believe in dualism? Are you non-dual? Do you believe in teleological processes? So it's kind of interesting because I've read so many different things, and if I were to kind of pigeonhole myself, and we may or may not have had this discussion in the past. Um, I will tell you that I probably belong in the category of an agnostic. Okay. And the reason I say that is that I'm somebody who, in having acquired all this knowledge through my life, I need to remain humble. And because of the paradoxical process, it's a paradoxical process in that the more that you learn, the more that you understand that I don't really know anything. Kind of like, we recourse to, a very famous quote, the only thing I know is that I know nothing, right? Echoed by a very famous Greek philosopher. And that is true for me, in that, we have the orthodox stream of sciences, which tells us that, which alludes to a materialistic frame of reference. But then there's all these other esoteric countercultures, which vie for a very, very a vitalistic culture and something completely different. And these streams of knowledge are much more ancient than, the orthodox, what parades as orthodox science today. So, one thing that I did hear from a parapsychologist a while ago was something to the effect of, we don't really experience reality, like full blown reality, because we are, you know, neurological simulators, or we're neurosimulators. And what we do experience is a particular physiological or neurophysiological pattern in the brain, which is only an partially accurate simulation of reality. Okay. And a partially accurate simulation of reality is probably not going to, is not very reflective of truth, right? So there's
Right.
a lot of information that we receive because of the fact that we need to receive it through our five senses, which to help us navigate the environment, the social environment, and which helps keep us alive, right? So it's for evolutionary purposes, but there's a lot of information out there, a lot of bandwidths, of information that we're not privy to because we don't need to be. We don't need this information to survive, and it's screened out, through our neurological systems, right? And
Yes.
prefrontal cortex and all that kind of stuff,
Yes.
right? Yeah. But
Yes.
that's what I believe, and I don't pretend to know what else is out there. There's colors that we can't see. You look at the electromagnetic spectrum, and we only are privy to a specific bandwidth
Certain
of that,
exactly. We can
right?
see this much of what's happening in
Happening,
our
yeah,
actual
exactly.
environment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, so animals, some other animals are privy to more.
Yeah.
Hawks and birds have better color vision than what we do. Snakes can see infrared, all that kind of stuff. So we're not privy to any of that. And so we need to proceed with immense humility for the great mystery of life. So that's why I say I'm agnostic in that I don't have enough information to come to the conclusion of whether there is a supernatural agency or a primordial energy at work or whether there isn't. My intuition is that there is some kind of primordial, energy or force at work. But I can't quite describe the nature of that entity.
I
Mm.
can dig that. I came from a total atheistic point of view, and I have traveled many a moon through my health, through plant medicine journeys, through talking to people, through reading books. And I can dig the agnostic point of view because it does come from a place of humility. And even though I am starting to settle into a few beliefs, I'm starting to settle into we really all are energy.
Yes.
It is so much more about energy, frequency, vibration than it is about anything else you could possibly chalk it up to.
Mhm.
But I also know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's okay to but Christy, it's okay to admit that I don't know.
Yeah.
That comes from a place of humility. We'll have this intolerance for ambiguity, and a lot of people need to speak from a position of authority power and say, yes, it's this way, or yes, it's that way. Well, the truth is you actually don't know. It's just an
Exactly.
opinion based on your own experience. And
Yep.
what the information that you receive is only a partially accurate simulation of reality. So in truth,
Yes.
you don't really know. You're just making an assumption. So that I think we can agree with that. I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to end the show right
Yes.
there. We
Yes.
don't know, ladies and gentlemen. We
Yes.
just don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, Paul, I really appreciate your time today. I know you're jet lagged. I know you've got a lot going on. And, our conversation was stimulating. You could
Yes.
go on forever with alchemy. It is a diverse, complicated topic, but hope that we illuminated it a little bit for the audience. It's
Yes.
it's chemical, it's symbolism, it's spiritual, it's so much. Dive into his book. It covers it all. It is called The Riddle of Alchemy, and it is a riddle
Yes. Yes.
appropriately titled.
Yeah.
Um, I will put that in the show notes. Pick up his book, get into alchemy. I mean, it was a pleasure to have you. Come back
Yeah.
anytime, Paul. I'd love to talk more about spirituality. Your brilliant mind. I wish you well.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and leave it there. I'd like to thank Paul for coming on the show today. We will see you next week on From Atheism to Enlightenment. Cheers, everybody. Journey well. And that is a wrap on this episode of Fate From Atheism to Enlightenment. I hope you enjoyed that one. Alchemy is a tough topic to discuss because it is, I feel, complicated, convoluted, mist, mist, very mystery, like mysterious. It's something that you can't eat the whole meal in one setting. You kind of have to go in, take a bite, walk away, come back, take a few more bites. to really digest properly what it is, what it entails, and how broad it is when people use the word alchemy out there, especially in the circles I've been walking in. I've been hearing that word alchemy, and I think it was only until I read Paul's book that I understood it to be more than one thing. It is um people talk about alchemy in a symbolic way to illuminate our spiritual development here on the third plane. People talk about the alchemical aspect of alchemy and the transmutation of elements from one thing into another using a lot of our own powerful intentions, beliefs, which I think is the most fascinating thing about the alchemical process is that they say will not work unless you believe. It won't work unless you have full faith. Your intentions in the ceremonial process of this transmutation matter. And without it, it's the magic doesn't work. So I think that's the most exciting, fascinating thing about the entire thing. And it makes sense that the church would suppress something like that. Because if we are that powerful, where our own intentions, focus, power can transmute or add to that process in a way that most of us in our modern day society would be under the impression is impossible, quite frankly. Completely wackadoodle impossible. So that's one of the fascinating things I think about when we say the word alchemy, you know? I'm wondering if we'll ever see that process used in any real way in modern times. We'll see. Maybe I'll have to have Paul back on, have another discussion about alchemy, because quite frankly, we just kind of tap the surface of it. And he's a brilliant man. He knows much more than I do about it for sure. So pick up his book, The Riddle of Alchemy. It does go into the history of it, it goes into all of the different components of alchemy when you're talking about this topic. It's pretty broad, deep, and intellectually challenging. It was a challenging book for me to read. Like I was really having to kind of reread some stuff to wrap my head around what was being conveyed to me. So, but Paul's a genius. He doesn't have those problems. Uh anyways, guys, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. If you are enjoying the show and you are feeling that I'm offering up good concepts, good information, good discussions, enlightening topics, any of the above, do me a favor. Share, subscribe to my show, like, tell a friend, turn somebody on to this show so I can continue to keep doing it and raise the vibration of this planet. I feel like we have a year of change upon us, ladies and gentlemen, for better or for worse. And I'm hoping that this podcast will help us keep a calm head, vibrate higher, and don't fear anything. Keep your own center calm in whatever storm you are coming upon. I'm telling you, that is the best advice I can give everyone for 2025 is fear not, remain calm, and vibrate high. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next week on Fate from Atheism to Enlightenment. Follow me on Instagram, please. I'm at F.A.T.E. podcast. I post clips. I'm going to start doing more, but that's where I'm at. We'll see you next week on Fate from Atheism to Enlightenment. Journey well out there, gang. And welcome to your fate, everyone.